You will sign these papers tonight, or I will make certain every person in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of daughter you turned out to be. Your father was not competent when he made that private promise to you, and the medical records prove it. Mason has already spoken with the title company, and the cabin is as good as transferred. Stop pretending you were ever the one he trusted with anything important. If you fight this, I will destroy what little reputation you still have left in Roanoke. Hi, my name is Peyton Holt, I am 31 years old. Those 5 sentences came out of my mother's mouth while we stood in the small conference room of the gated community clubhouse on the outskirts of Roanoke, Virginia. I had only agreed to meet because she said it concerned my father's final wishes. I did not expect the folder already open on the table or the family friend sitting beside her with a pen ready for my signature. Mason Quinn had been around our family for years. He helped my father with small business paperwork and showed up at holidays with the same easy smile. That night his smile was gone. He kept his eyes on the documents and never once looked at me directly. My mother slid the top page closer and tapped the signature line with one perfectly manicured nail. This is a voluntary relinquishment of any claim to the lake cabin, she said. Your father left verbal instructions that it should stay in the family through me. The medical records from his last year show he was confused and easily influenced. You took advantage of that. I felt the words land like cold water. The cabin was the one place my father and I had ever been completely alone together. He had walked me through the rooms 2 months before he passed and said, clear as day, that it would be mine when the time came. He even wrote a short note and left it in the desk drawer. I still had a photograph of that note on my phone. I never took advantage of anyone, I answered, keeping my voice steady even though my hands had started to shake. He was clear. He was himself. My mother let out a short, tired laugh. Clear? The man could barely remember what day it was by then. Mason has the hospital records. They were reviewed. The signature on that little note of yours does not match the ones from his competent years. You forged it, or you pushed him into it. Either way, it ends tonight. Mason finally spoke, still not meeting my eyes. It is cleaner this way, Peyton. Sign, and we avoid a public mess. The HOA already has questions about the property taxes. Better to settle it privately. I looked from one face to the other and felt something inside me crack open. This was not a discussion. It was a setup. The papers were already filled out. The medical records were already reviewed. The family friend my father had trusted was sitting there as the enforcer. I did not sign. I stood up, gathered my bag, and walked out of the clubhouse while my mother called after me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Claire Brennan, an HOA member who happened to be finishing a meeting in the next room, watched me leave. She did not say anything then, but her eyes followed me all the way to the parking lot. That night I sat in my car for a long time before I could even start the engine. The promised future my father had described, quiet weekends at the cabin, a place that was mine, had never existed the way I believed. My mother and the man she called a family friend had already rewritten it. If you have ever had someone you trusted suddenly demand that you give up the one thing that still felt like home, tell me in the comments. I need to know I am not the only one who felt the floor disappear. The next morning the first email arrived. It came from an address I did not recognize, but the subject line was simply my full name and the words medical clarification. Attached were 3 pages of hospital records with dates that matched my father's final months. Someone had highlighted sections claiming he suffered from progressive confusion and could not make binding decisions. The sender's note said only, "These were submitted to the title company yesterday. Thought you should see them before they become public." I forwarded everything to Cole Mercer, the attorney I had quietly consulted months earlier when my mother first started making comments about family assets. He called me within the hour. "These records look altered," he said. "The formatting on the later entries does not match the hospital's standard templates. We need the originals." I told him I would try. That same afternoon Camille Trent at the local bank branch informed me that a temporary freeze had been placed on a small account my father had left in my name. The freeze notice listed Barbara Holt and Mason Quinn as the petitioning parties and cited the same medical records as evidence of potential undue influence. I drove to the bank and stood at Camille's desk while she explained, carefully and without warmth, that the freeze would remain until the matter was clarified. Mason had already been there that morning. He had brought coffee for the staff and left with a photocopy of the freeze confirmation. By evening the first quiet comments began circulating in the gated community. Claire Brennan texted me a screenshot of a group message thread among several HOA members. Someone had written that I was causing problems over a cabin I never really owned and that my mother was only trying to protect the family's good name. Claire added one line of her own, "I do not believe that version. Call me if you need a witness to what happened in the clubhouse." I did not call her yet. I was still trying to understand how quickly the story had turned. My mother had not simply asked for the cabin. She had arrived with prepared documents, altered records, a cooperative family friend, and a plan to make me look unstable if I resisted. 2 days later Lila Coulter, a records clerk at the regional medical center, left a voicemail on my phone. She spoke softly and quickly. I pulled the original file for Frank Holt after a request came through for certified copies. The versions that were submitted to the title company and the bank do not match what we have in the archive. There are added paragraphs and changed dates. I am not supposed to contact family members directly, but something is wrong. If you have an attorney, have him subpoena the originals before they disappear. I played the message 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Cole. He scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. That night my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was calm, almost gentle. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. Mason is only trying to help the family move forward. Sign the papers and this ends. Keep fighting and people will start asking why a 31-year-old woman is so desperate to keep property that was never hers. Think carefully about the reputation you still have." I deleted the message. Then I opened the photograph of my father's handwritten note one more time. The words were still there. "The cabin is yours when I am gone. Keep it safe." I closed the phone and sat in the quiet of my apartment, feeling the full weight of what had been taken from me before I even knew the fight had started. The promised future had never been real in their eyes. They had only been waiting for the right moment to erase it. The next morning Cole and I sat across from Lila Coulter in a small office at the medical center. She placed the original chart on the table beside the altered copies. The differences were obvious once you knew where to look. Dates had been shifted. A paragraph describing progressive confusion had been inserted in a different font. The signature block on one page did not match the attending physician's usual style. Lila's voice stayed low. I reported the discrepancy internally. They told me to wait for further instruction. I do not think they are going to move quickly. Cole photographed every page. On the drive back he said the next step was a formal demand letter and a request for an injunction to stop the title transfer. He also mentioned that Mason Quinn's name appeared on the submission documents as a concerned family associate. I nodded, but the words felt distant. Somewhere between the clubhouse confrontation and the altered records, the ground under my life had shifted. My mother was not simply grieving or protecting assets. She was rewriting my father's voice and using a man he had trusted to do it. That afternoon Paige Lang, a woman I had known through mutual friends and who had once dated Mason briefly years earlier, showed up at my door with a folder of her own. "I still have access to some of the old email threads from when Mason and I were together," she said. "He never changed the password on this shared cloud folder. There are messages between him and your mother from 3 months before your father passed. They talk about the cabin. They talk about making sure the medical language supports incapacity if needed." I printed everything. She handed me the pages. I read the first email and felt the last piece of hope I had been holding on to dissolve. The conversation was calm, practical, and completely cold. My mother had been planning the alteration long before my father was even hospitalized for the final time. Paige watched my face and said quietly, "I am sorry. I should have seen it sooner." I thanked her and closed the door. Then I sat on the floor of my living room with the printed emails spread around me and finally let the tears come. They were not loud. They were the kind that arrive when you realize the people who were supposed to protect the truth had spent months building a different one. Cole called an hour later. The title company had received a rush request to complete the transfer. We had 48 hours before the cabin would legally leave my father's estate and move into my mother's control, with Mason listed as a secondary interest holder. I stared at the clock on my phone and felt the deadline settle over me like a weight. 48 hours. That was all the time left before the last piece of my father's private promise disappeared forever. The 48-hour window felt shorter every time I checked the clock. Cole filed the emergency demand letter that same afternoon and requested an immediate hold on any title transfer involving the lake cabin. The title company acknowledged receipt but gave no promise that the hold would stick. I spent the rest of the day gathering every scrap of proof I still had: the photograph of my father's handwritten note, the original dates from the hospital discharge summaries Lila had confirmed, and the printed emails Paige had brought me. Each page felt heavier than the last. The emails showed my mother and Mason discussing the exact wording that later appeared in the altered records. They had planned the language months before my father ever entered the hospital for the final time. That evening Claire Brennan knocked on my door. She stood on the step with her arms crossed and a printed HOA group message in her hand. "People are talking," she said. "Your mother told 3 different board members that you fabricated a deathbed promise and that the medical records prove your father was not capable of making decisions. Mason has been repeating the same story at the clubhouse. I told them I was in the next room when she made the demand, but they are choosing the version that keeps the community quiet." I invited her inside. We sat at my kitchen table while she walked me through the message thread. One comment called me unstable and money-hungry. Another suggested the HOA should consider whether I remained a suitable resident if I continued creating conflict. Claire's own replies had been careful and factual. She had stated only what she witnessed. No one had answered her. "I will testify if it comes to that," she said before she left. "But you should know the temperature is rising fast." I thanked her and locked the door. The moment she was gone I felt the isolation settle in again. Even the people who believed me could only do so much. The story my mother and Mason were telling had already taken root. The next morning Cole called with worse news. The temporary bank freeze on the small account my father had left me had been extended. Camille Trent at the branch informed him that additional documentation had been submitted overnight, more pages of the same altered medical records, this time accompanied by a notarized statement from Mason claiming he had observed my father's declining capacity during multiple visits. The statement was dated 3 weeks after my father had already stopped recognizing most visitors. I drove to the bank myself. Camille kept her expression neutral while she explained that the freeze would remain in place until a court or mutual agreement lifted it. When I asked whether anyone had verified the medical records against the hospital originals, she simply repeated the policy. Mason had been there again. That morning, he had left a second copy of his notarized statement on her desk. Outside in the parking lot I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel until my hands stopped trembling. Every door I tried to open was already locked from the other side. Paige met me for coffee later that day. She looked exhausted. "I confronted Mason," she said without preamble. "I told him I still had the emails. He laughed and said no one would believe a bitter ex-girlfriend over a grieving widow and a longtime family friend. Then he asked whether I had considered how those emails might look if someone claimed I altered them myself." Her voice stayed quiet, but the fear underneath it was clear. Mason had already prepared the next move. If the emails became public, he would claim Paige had fabricated them out of spite. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "You do not have to do anything else. You already gave me the truth. That is enough." She shook her head. It is not enough if they get away with this. That night the secret emails leaked. I still do not know who sent them. A blank account forwarded the entire thread to every active email address on the HOA distribution list, including Claire, the board contact Julian Benton, and several neighbors I barely knew. Within an hour my phone began lighting up with messages. Some people asked if the emails were real. Others simply forwarded them with no comment. One message from an unknown number said only, "Your mother is going to bury you for this." I called Cole immediately. He told me to screenshot everything and stay offline. He would issue a preservation letter first thing in the morning. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my mother's face in the clubhouse conference room, calm and certain, while she erased the last private conversation I had ever had with my father. The cabin had never been about the building itself. It had been the only place where his voice still felt clear. Now even that was being rewritten. At 7 the next morning Julian Benton, the board contact, called. His voice was careful. "The emails are everywhere," he said. "Several residents are demanding an emergency HOA meeting tonight. Your mother has already requested time to speak. Mason will be there as well. You should come if you want any chance to respond." I agreed. Cole said he would attend with me. The meeting was held in the same clubhouse conference room where my mother had first demanded the signature. Chairs lined the walls. Nearly 30 people filled the space. Claire sat near the front. Lila Coulter had driven over after work and taken a seat in the back, though she was not an HOA member. Paige stood against the far wall, arms folded. My mother arrived 5 minutes late, dressed in soft gray, the picture of restrained grief. Mason walked in beside her carrying a thin folder. They took seats at the head of the table as if the room already belonged to them. Julian called the meeting to order and stated that the purpose was to address circulating documents related to a private property dispute. He invited my mother to speak first. She stood slowly. Her voice was low and steady. "I never wanted any of this to become public. My daughter has chosen to turn a family matter into a spectacle. The medical records are clear. My husband was not competent in his final months. The cabin was always meant to remain under my care. Mason has only tried to help us settle this quietly. The emails some of you received were selectively edited and taken out of context. I ask only that this community not allow one person's desperation to damage the peace we have all worked to protect." Several heads nodded. Mason opened his folder and passed around copies of the altered records and his notarized statement. No one asked for the originals. When Julian invited me to respond, I stood on legs that felt unsteady. Cole remained seated beside me, ready if needed. I kept my voice even. "The records you are holding do not match the hospital originals. A records clerk has already confirmed the discrepancies. The emails were not edited. They show planning that began months before my father was ever hospitalized. I am not asking this community to take my side. I am asking you not to accept a rewritten version of my father's words without checking the source." I placed copies of Lila's comparison notes and the original hospital dates on the table. Claire stood and confirmed what she had witnessed in the clubhouse the night of the demand. Paige spoke next, briefly, about the cloud folder and the dates of the emails. Lila, from the back, simply stated that the submitted versions did not match the archive. The room grew quiet. For a moment I thought the truth might be enough. Then my mother rose again. Her tone never rose, but every word cut deeper than shouting would have. "You see how easily she gathers people to her cause. A records clerk who is not even part of this community. A former girlfriend with a grudge. An HOA member who enjoys drama. My daughter has always needed an audience. My husband loved her, but he also knew her limitations. The cabin is not hers. It never was. And if this continues, I will be forced to protect the family's name by every legal means available." She looked directly at me when she finished. The message was clear. Fighting further would cost me more than the cabin. It would cost me the last fragile threads of belonging I still had in the only place I had ever called home. Julian closed the meeting without a vote. People filed out in small groups, speaking in low voices. Claire touched my arm as she passed and said she was still with me. Paige waited until the room emptied, then hugged me once, hard. Lila left without speaking, but she nodded once from the doorway. Cole and I walked to the parking lot in silence. He finally said, "We can still file for the injunction tomorrow. The evidence is strong enough." I nodded, but the words felt far away. Inside the clubhouse, my mother and Mason were still talking with Julian. Through the glass I watched her rest a hand on Mason's arm the way she used to rest it on my father's. The gesture was small and familiar and completely final. I drove home alone. The 48 hours had already expired while we sat in that room. The title company had processed the transfer 30 minutes before the meeting began. The cabin was gone. My phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. The text contained only a single photograph: the interior of the lake cabin, lights on, a new set of keys lying on the kitchen counter. The caption underneath read, "Family takes care of its own." I set the phone down and stared at the dark window of my apartment. Somewhere out there my mother and the family friend who had helped her were already settling into the future they had written for themselves. The one they had decided I would never be part of. And for the first time I understood that the real loss was not the cabin. It was the quiet certainty that I no longer had a family left to lose. I sat with that photograph on my phone until the screen went dark. The cabin lights were on. New keys rested on the counter my father and I had once used for morning coffee. The message had no signature, but I did not need one. My mother and Mason had already moved in. The next morning Cole confirmed the title transfer was complete. The emergency hold had never been entered. Someone at the title company had processed the paperwork the moment the 48 hours expired. Cole offered to file a formal challenge based on the altered records and the leaked emails. He said the evidence was strong enough to force a hearing. I listened to every option he listed. Then I thanked him and asked him to stop. "I cannot keep bleeding for a place they have already taken," I told him. "File whatever is necessary to protect my name on the medical records discrepancy. Nothing more." He was quiet for a long moment. "You understand that walking away means they keep the cabin?" "I understand." That afternoon I drove to the medical center and met Lila Coulter one last time. She had already submitted an internal report about the mismatched records. She looked tired but steady. "I will keep the originals secure," she said. "If anyone ever subpoenas them, the truth is here." I am sorry it was not enough to stop the transfer. I told her she had done more than most people ever would. Then I left. Claire Brennan called that evening. The HOA had held a closed discussion after the public meeting. Several members wanted distance from the entire situation. Claire had spoken up for me again, but the majority preferred silence. She sounded frustrated and a little ashamed. "I still believe you," she said. "But this community has chosen the quieter story." I thanked her for every word she had spoken on my behalf and told her she did not owe me anything further. After we hung up I deleted the HOA group messages from my phone. Paige came by the next day with a small box of my father's old photographs that Mason had once stored at her place years earlier. She set the box on my table and did not sit down. "I am moving out of state next month," she said. "Too many reminders here. I wanted you to have these before I left." We stood in my living room for a long time without speaking. When she finally hugged me goodbye I felt the last thin thread of shared history slip away. Paige had risked her own reputation to bring me the emails. Now she was leaving too. 3 days later a formal letter arrived from an attorney I had never heard of. The letter introduced a man named Victor Langley, a distant cousin on my father's side. According to the documents, my father had quietly updated a separate personal trust 2 years earlier, naming Victor as the residual beneficiary of any remaining personal property not otherwise assigned. The lake cabin had been listed in that residual category. Because the title had already transferred through the altered records process, Victor's attorney was now opening an independent claim against both my mother and Mason. The true heir had appeared. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Victor could pursue whatever rights he believed he held. I would not join the fight. The cabin had already been taken from me once. I would not spend another year watching lawyers argue over the pieces. My mother called the same afternoon the letter arrived. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something in me still needed to hear her voice one final time. "You put him up to this," she said without greeting. "That cousin never cared about the family until you started stirring trouble. Mason and I will handle it. Stay out of it, Peyton. You have already done enough damage." I waited until she finished. My voice stayed quiet. "I am not involved in any claim. I am finished. Do not call me again. Do not contact me through other people. Do not use my name in any community conversation. If you do, I will document it and I will protect myself. That is the only boundary I am setting. Everything else is already gone." There was a long silence on the other end. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted into something colder. "You always did choose yourself first." "Yes," I answered. "I do now." I ended the call. Then I blocked her number and Mason's. I sent a brief written notice to Cole confirming that I wanted no further contact with either of them and that any future communication should go through him only if legally required. That night I packed the few remaining items that still connected me to the gated community, the HOA welcome packet, a community directory, a single photograph from a long-ago holiday gathering, and placed them in a donation box. I would not attend another family gathering. There were none left that included me. The emotional weight arrived 2 days later without warning. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when the full emptiness settled over me. My father was gone. The cabin was gone. The version of my mother who might one day admit the truth had never existed. The family friend who had smiled at every holiday table had helped rewrite medical records to erase my father's last clear wish. Even the people who had stood with me for a moment, Claire, Lila, Paige, had returned to their own lives, as they should. I sat down on the kitchen floor and cried until there was nothing left. It was not dramatic. It was simply the sound of a life that had been built on a promised future finally accepting that the promise had been hollow from the start. When the tears stopped, I stayed on the floor for a long time, breathing in the quiet. Silence, I realized, was the only thing that still protected what remained of my heart. I did not challenge the title. I did not join Victor's claim. I did not return to the clubhouse or the HOA meetings or any community event where my mother and Mason still moved freely. I changed my mailing address, updated every account, and began looking for a small place farther from the outskirts of Roanoke, somewhere no one knew the Holt name or the story that had been told about me. Cole sent one final update weeks later. The investigation into the altered medical records had been formally opened by the hospital's compliance office. Lila's report had forced their hand. My mother and Mason had retained counsel. The process would take months, possibly longer. None of it would return the cabin to me. None of it would restore the family I had lost long before the papers were signed. I thanked him and asked him to close my file on the property matter. The only thing I still wanted protected was my own name. I live alone now. The apartment is quiet. Some nights the quiet feels like peace. Other nights it feels like the exact size of everything I had to leave behind. I do not regret the boundary I set. I only regret how long I waited to set it. Self-respect came first, even when it left me with empty hands. Thank you for listening to my story. If you ever reached the moment when choosing yourself meant walking away with nothing but your own name, would you still choose yourself?